Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Benjamin Moll, who is Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. His research is concerned with understanding why some countries and people are so much poorer than others, and how micro-heterogeneity impacts the macroeconomy and macroeconomic policy. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me. Really great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So you have a research agenda at LSE, and I want to go through some of the areas of your interest. You say in the piece that you sent me, one of the key developments in macroeconomics research over the last 3 decades has been the incorporation of explicit heterogeneity into the models of the macroeconomy. As a result of taking microdata seriously, these theories study macroeconomic questions in terms of distributions of microeconomic variables like income or wealth, rather than just aggregates. Yeah, this is quite interesting, Ben. So when we think about macroeconomics, generally we think about systems and system-wide effects, and models tend to look at things at that level. And you're taking it in a slightly different direction. You're saying the participants in large systems are diverse, and that should have an impact on outcomes?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the philosophy, I guess, is sort of to build everything up from the ground, right? To take really seriously what we know from people's behavior that we see in microdata and what our friends, the microeconomists, have been studying for many years. You know, their people's consumption behavior, their savings behavior, how they behave in labor markets and so on, and try to put that in the macro models. And then when you do that and you look at the microdata, one of the first things that will jump out at you is just how much heterogeneity there is across people in virtually every data variable you look at. In particular, in things like income and wealth. I mean, there are some people who are phenomenally wealthy, right? And then there's other people who either have no assets whatsoever, or they even have a massive amount of debt. Right. And so essentially, or for income as well, some people have a very high annual income flow, and some other people have live off government benefits, say. And so we want to sort of take that seriously in the macro models and sort of use that as the main building block for thinking about macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic shocks and how the economy behaves.
So in other words, averages don't work.
That's exactly right. That is exactly the right way to think about it. You can't just look at the aggregates. The aggregates mask a lot of relevant heterogeneity, and then the key idea is that there's a lot of sort of non-linearity at the micro level in, say, people's consumption and savings decisions. So, for example, if you give a rich person an extra dollar, he'll do something very different with that, or eat a lot less of that than if you give a poor person an extra dollar. And because of that nonlinearity, you cannot aggregate up. And so exactly as you say, the averages don't tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, and so it seems intuitive, Ben. And if you look at sort of the cross-sectional distribution of wealth or income in almost any economy today, you see very, very high variability, as you mentioned. And so studying these large systems requires one to incorporate, I would imagine, that variability. You talk about Hank models here,
Right.
heterogeneous agent, new Keynesian models. Could you describe what they are?
Sure. So yeah, that's sort of a special case, if you want, or a particular application of this sort of broader philosophy of heterogeneous agent modeling, or I guess I sometimes like to call it sort of distributional macroeconomics, where you really take the distribution and heterogeneity seriously. And there, the main idea is to think about building such models to think about macroeconomic policy, in particular monetary and fiscal policy. And so as a background, or a useful background to understand sort of what the main contribution is of these Hank models, is it's sort of useful to take a step back and think about what the more traditional models are that, say, central banks had been using for many years to think about macroeconomic policies. And these are what's called representative agent New Keynesian models, as opposed to the models we work with, right, which are these heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models. So in these representative agent New Keynesian models, right, the idea is that there's sort of a stand-in household, and you can sort of think about an economy as if there's just sort of a one stand-in household. And the main thing is that the way these models work, say for monetary policy, is they say that the way monetary policy works, it's all about what's called inter-temporal substitution. So inter-temporal substitution is the idea that if the central bank cuts interest rates, so say the US Federal Reserve Bank cuts the federal funds rate, then people think, oh, now is a bad time to save, it's a good time to borrow, and then they do that and they increase their consumption. And what we're essentially saying is that if you look at the microdata, it doesn't look like this. Instead, the sort of theory of intertemporal substitution only applies to sort of a small fraction of the population. And instead, what people do is they don't respond, or a lot of people don't respond to interest rate changes a lot. And what they respond to instead is changes to their income, so their labor income in particular. And so then we kind of built this kind of a heterogeneous agent model and sort of glue it together with one of these more traditional New Keynesian models to think about monetary policy. And then you get this sort of a pretty different perspective of the transmission mechanism of, say, monetary policy, or also the power of fiscal policy, which is all about people responding to changes in their labor incomes rather than income changes in their interest rates they face. So this,
Do I understand this, Ben? So in the representative model, we are assuming financial flexibility. We are assuming sort of decision flexibility for all agents, all representative agents, so to speak.
Exactly.
And oftentimes, agents, or large proportion of the agents, don't really have decision flexibility to really effect inter-temporal substitution that's assumed. And so we don't get the outcomes we're looking for, right?
Exactly. So the key assumption that you're kind of making when you're imposing this representative agent is essentially that all people in the economy are sort of not financially constrained, meaning they if they want to borrow an extra dollar, they can do so. But what we see in the data is that there's a lot of people who look like what the people in literature call hand to mouth. So they look like they're up against some sort of a constraint, as in they have zero assets or they're up against a credit card limit. And if they want to borrow more, they can't. And then these hand to mouth people, essentially, because they're exactly constrained and they can't sort of intertemporally substitute, they're not going to respond to these interest rate changes. But on the other hand, they're going to respond very strongly to income changes. If you give someone who's hand to mouth an extra dollar, he's going to eat it. That's exactly the difference to the representative agent models.
So in the heterogeneous models, are you sort of clustering the population? Obviously, we can model every individual in the system. So you come up with a set of sort of clusters in the economy, and then model those behaviors. How do you do that?
No, you actually do it differently. You do actually kind of try to model every individual in the economy. So the whole philosophy is, rather than having sort of distinct groups of people, there's an entire cross-sectional distribution of people that looks just like what you'd see in the data. And then also people, may have this hand-to-mouth status where they're constrained for some years or for a given amount of time, but then they may also, leave that hand-to-mouth state again. So, some person who is unemployed may display this type of hand-to-mouth behavior, but then when they find a job again and they have a higher labor income, then they can accumulate some liquid savings again, and then they're maybe actually gonna over time be again one of these people who is more like an intertemporal substitutor, so behaves more like one of these representative agents. So the whole thing is that everything's sort of endogenous, and how people respond depends on their position in the wealth distribution, and that's sort of an endogenous object that you need to carry around.
Yeah, so the inputs are then the distribution of income and wealth. And when you sample from that, depending on where you're sampling from, you have some expectations as to what behavior you can see, right?
Exactly. So the key sort of what's called the state variable of the system is just the cross-sectional joint distribution of income and wealth. And then the thing that drives that, typically in these models, is that some people are smart and some people are less smart, and some people get lucky in the sense that they get a promotion and have high labor income, and some other people they get unlucky in the sense that they lose their jobs, and there's a sort of lot of churn at the micro level, inside that model within the distribution. But you kind of have to think about people sort of moving around and having these sort of idiosyncratic experiences depending on whether they get lucky or not.
So this clearly has a lot of applications in COVID-19 policies. We will come back to that so that we can talk about it in more detail. I want to look at some of your other interests at LSC. One of them is theories of rising income and wealth inequality.
Right.
So what are the insights from that area?
Right. So one particular paper that we've been working on is this is joined with Lucas Rachel and Pasquale Restrepo. Is we've essentially been trying to understand the impact of automation on income and wealth inequality. So automation being defined as technical change that replaces tasks that were previously performed by labor with capital. So, a robot or maybe an AI algorithm also now does something that people used to do. And the key idea is there's obviously a big literature in economics on, the effects of automation on the labor market in particular. And the key result that people in that literature typically stress is that automation affects wage inequality in the sense that some people who are skilled benefit from automation, and other people who are unskilled lose from automation. What we're saying is that what this whole literature is forgetting, and what we should also be focusing on, is what automation or technical change more generally does for owners of capital. And so the key idea in our work is that essentially there's some people who essentially are capital owners, and then when there's more automation, it's not just the high-skilled people, the high-skilled workers who benefit, but also the owners of capital. So just to give an example, essentially, if there's if robots become more productive, then what the sort of existing literature had been stressing is mostly that some people some workers benefit from there being more robots, and some people lose from there being more robots. What we're saying is one of the other primary thing that happens is that the people who own the robots are going to massively benefit, And then essentially what's going to happen is that at the top of the income and wealth distributions, there are a lot of these people who own private businesses and that benefit from automation, that then are going to, then inequality is going to increase. Like an example, let me give one concrete example, which would be, say the owner of Zara, the clothing manufacturer. Now I forget his name, and a Spanish gentleman. He got massively wealthy, right? And I guess we would be saying that this is partly due to the fact that he's been replacing, workers in the plant sewing his clothes with machines who now sew the clothes, and he's getting the returns from these machines getting better over time, rather than these accruing to workers.
Right. Yeah. So let me know if I understand this correctly, Ben. So it makes a lot of sense to me. So when we think about robots, artificial intelligence in general, replacing labor with machines, generally speaking, the returns to capital is increasing and the returns to labor is decreasing, right? That is the environment that we are going into.
Right. That is the rough idea. Yes, that's correct.
And so when we look out, and we can already see signs of this, I think just about 5 or 6 companies represent 1/3 of the market capitalization of S&P 500 today.
Right.
And so you would imagine this trend to continue, that scale becomes, sort of the governing criteria for success, because with scale and financial flexibility, you can invest more into capital, and capital returns higher and higher. It's sort of a runaway mechanism that sweeps all the wealth out of the economy and dumps it in the pockets of maybe a few people.
Right. In our theory, it's not a runaway mechanism, so it does stop at some point. The only way it would be a runaway mechanism is if the automation keeps continuing forever. So what automation does essentially in our theory, it more or less just directly reduces the share of total income that accrues to labor, and instead makes this income share accrue to capital. And so it would be the only scenario in which it would be a runaway process is if automation essentially drives the labor share to 0 and the capital share to 1. But we don't think that would happen. So we do think it would probably stop at some point. For sure, we're very far away from a labor share of 0% and a capital share of 100%. So we do think it would probably stop at some point, and then you also won't have this process completely running away.
Yeah, looking at what we are seeing today, there is, I believe, at least this is an opinion, it's a speculation, there is a distinct possibility that we can drive labor share to 0. If that's the case, then it has policy implications, right? Now, people are already talking about minimum guaranteed income. Right. We already know many jobs that are repeating jobs. Humans are not that good at them, and they do them because they exist. If they don't exist, then they will be replaced. They don't exist, meaning they don't exist for humans, replaced by machines. Then at the highest level, you need some other. I'm making a statement, Ben. You can correct me. Some other way to sort of moderate the system, right? Otherwise it will break ultimately.
Right. There's sort of a broader. Okay, so let me take one step. I think in general in economics, it's kind of hard to predict the future. So I'm always a little bit uncomfortable speculating about these kind of very long run developments. My reading of the literature is that there are a number of sort of offsetting mechanisms. In particular, I guess one main reason to automate for firms is that currently labor costs are kind of high. But if the more you automate, the more people would want to work in the jobs that are in the tasks that have not been automated yet. So then at some point, the labor cost, you would think, would fall, and there would be sort of a self-correcting mechanism where at some point it wouldn't pay off to automate anymore, because you can employ workers so cheaply. But yes, there is a question, at what point this, and there's other offsetting mechanisms like this as well. There is a question at what point this process would self-correct, and then I guess that's why one may want to talk about such things as a universal basic income and so on. But most economists are kind of skeptical of that, I think, is my understanding.
Yeah. Without knowing a lot about it, purely from a technical perspective, I think we are far from, some sort of self-correcting mechanism to kick in, because, if you look at technology hardware costs, they continue to decline. There are new technologies on the horizon like quantum computing. And so, the per unit cost of technology, if we see that continues to decline, it sort of says that this trend is going to continue for a while. The question for labor then would be, Ben, do people want to do these jobs in the future?
No, that is absolutely correct. Yeah, but let me just follow up on the first part of your sentence. It's true that the trend keeps continuing, but it's also happening relatively slowly. I mean, the pace at which the labor share is falling in these many advanced economies is relatively small. I don't have the exact numbers here now, but it's like a few percentage points every 5 years or every 10 years. So it's not like we're rapidly converging towards a zero labor share or anything like this.
That's probably a good thing. I want to go into another area. You say continuous time methods for macro models with distributions. How are these different from what we typically do?
I mean, this sort of comes back to what we talked about first, which are these heterogeneous Asian models, in particular these Hank models. So the main thing is just because exactly of what I described earlier, that in these theories you have to carry around a whole cross-sectional distribution, essentially have a million different people in your model. These models are much harder to solve than traditional macroeconomic models where you just keep track of sort of macroeconomic aggregates. And then the thing you need to do, or sometimes pays off, I guess sometimes, is to develop new computational methods or new methods for working for characterizing and solving these models. And that there I've been developing some of these methods. Now, continuous time here, refers to a mathematical way of modeling time, as opposed to discrete time. I mean, this is getting way nerdy, by the way. But I mean, let me just briefly tell you, a discrete time model would be one where there's this year and next year and the year after, and those are sort of discrete dates you keep track of. Whereas a continuous time model is one where time flows continuously, as it does in the real world, right? There's minutes and seconds and milliseconds and so on. You can always subdivide time, and as we're progressing, time continues. And traditionally in economics, actually, kind of interestingly, people have been mostly working with discrete time models, where the main reason for doing so is that data typically comes observed at discrete time intervals, right? The national income and product accounts are released every quarter. Survey data are usually collected once a year, and so on. And what we've been pushing with some co-authors is the idea that actually, if you take seriously the idea that sort of time is continuously, it actually simplifies your life sometimes for modeling things. But this mostly comes back again to these heterogeneous Asian New Keynesian models, and I think it's more fun to talk about the economics, what this actually implies for monetary policy and fiscal policy. And for example, fiscal policy becomes much more powerful in these kind of models than what we traditionally think in these representative agent models. I think that's more important than focusing on the solution methods there, especially for your listeners, I think.
Yeah, so realistically, I mean, this is kind of modeling the system more realistically. This is actually what happens. And presumably we can get a better definition of the behavior of the system. It may not have a direct implication for actions or policy, which might just still be discrete.
Right. Well, I mean, actions and policies can also be, taken at least at a sort of approximately continuous level, right? I mean, if you think about, interest rates and the monetary authority, so the central bank setting interest rates, I mean, what really matters is really high frequencies, right? I mean, and you think about financial markets and how they react to interest rate changes. I mean, that all happens within sort of seconds and milliseconds of a new monetary policy being introduced. So I do think fundamentally that actually the sort of continuous time way of modeling is in many circumstances more realistic, and then on top of that, sort of it makes your life easier. So that's in terms.
Yeah, it's mathematically, I would imagine, more tractable. You have three areas detailed here, Ben, on open questions and avenues for future research. I just touch on all three of them. So the first one is heterogeneous agent macro as a gateway to behavior macro, you say. So what's right?
So by that, it comes back to this philosophy that we touched upon earlier, which is that heterogeneous agent macro is all about building things from the ground up. Now, there's sort of a parallel literature that's more of a micro literature rather than a macro literature, which is called behavioral economics, which maybe you've interviewed some other people on your show already who work in this area. I don't know, where essentially the key idea is that people behave somewhat differently than your sort of optimizing, dynamically optimizing sort of homo economicus with rational expectations and so on, which is what we typically put in our macro models. Yeah, right. Humans. I mean, so I don't want to say something too strong here. I do think the homo economicus abstraction is extremely useful in many circumstances, but there are a number of areas where the micro literature has identified sort of people's behavior that doesn't look like what our standard models would predict. I mean, just to give you an example, which is something we've incorporated in our models, what you see quite often in microdata is some form of procrastination. Okay, so in particular, the type of procrastination we're interested in is procrastination in the decision to refinance your mortgage. So in the United States and many other countries, right, you have fixed rate mortgages, and so quite often then when interest rates fall, you as an individual could, if you go to the bank and refinance your mortgage, you could obtain a lower interest rate. So you could lock in a lower mortgage interest rate, and you could save yourself a lot of money. But what we see in the data, and sort of, again, this is not our work, but work our micro colleagues have done, or our finance colleagues have done, is that households or individuals do not, go to the bank as soon as interest rates fall and they could, lock in a lower interest rate. Instead, they wait sometimes quite a long time, or sometimes they never refinance, meaning they leave a lot of money on the table just because they're sort of don't get their act together, in quotation marks, to go to the bank and sort of refinance. There's other examples like this of sort of things that look like behavioral frictions. For example, that where we see this a lot is retirement savings decisions, right? The idea that it seems to matter quite a bit what the default option is. Quite a lot of people just stick sort of with their default retirement plan and never re-optimize it. and therefore also potentially leave a fair amount of money on the table, or at least don't have the product that's really tailor-made to them, and so on and so forth. And there's lots of things that look a bit like that. And so what we're basically just saying is, sort of in going with the philosophy of heterogeneous agent macro, let's put that sort of behavior into our models, and let's think about how it changes, predictions for how policy works and so on.
Yeah, so setting it up this way, that is, taking micro effects into account at the macro level, you can now introduce sort of micro behavioral effects into the model and see what happens at the macro level.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other area that you have here is asset price changes and wealth inequality. This is a very interesting thing here. So, we see this increasingly in the US, that founders of public companies have most of their wealth tied up in stock or options on that stock. And, when you count wealth, you're counting all of that. And you're asking if that is the same as
exactly.
wealth, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the question is exactly like, if you see like Jeff Bezos's wealth, it's all about what the market capitalization is of Amazon, or I mean more generally, even if just you or I hold some stocks, you may have large increases in your wealth because the stock prices increase. For example, I have some 401k retirement savings from my old job in the US, and I looked at my retirement savings account the other day, or like now a month ago, and the value of that retirement saving increased a lot throughout 2020 just because the stock market boomed, right? And so the question is that something we should be sort of interested in or concerned about, say maybe as policymakers, if some people's measured wealth increases a lot? And then maybe following up on that, is that maybe something we should be taxing or not? Should there maybe be a wealth tax? Should we maybe tax such capital gains, right? These asset price increases are essentially just capital gains. Should we tax them on accrual? So there's some policy proposals, for example, that say that Biden right now is reforming the capital gains tax system, and there's some people who are saying, oh, we should actually not just tax capital gains on realizations. So when you actually sell your stocks, we should also tax capital gains on accrual. So when Jeff Bezos gets richer because Amazon stock increases in value, we should tax him on that. And so I just thought that this is sort of an under-researched area that we should be thinking about more, because it's sort of a not at all an obvious question. And I think essentially the people in the public finance literature, in particular the people who are in favor of wealth taxation, they sometimes tend to forget that a increase in wealth that's due to the fact that an asset price increases is potentially a little bit different than an increase in wealth that happens because you actively save some extra money, say because your labor income increased, and put that on the side. I don't know, does that kind of make sense? I can talk more about this.
No, it does. Yeah. I mean, the other side of it, Ben, is, the operating aspects of it, right? So, one of the issues people are concerned about is CEO compensation, senior exec compensation, options, the timing of options exercise, and all of that. And, if you really critically look at it, it's really difficult to see the value of a human decision making to be that high. Especially, we can actually demonstrably show machines actually make decisions a lot better than humans in many cases. And so I think the operating aspects of this is still very problematic.
Yeah, so that comes back more to the question we discussed earlier, right? Maybe why has income inequality increased so much rather than wealth inequality. So there's a big literature which I haven't worked on. There's a big literature in economics on executive compensation, and there are sort of what's the right word? There's sort of more optimistic theories of that and more pessimistic one. Optimistic in the sense that some theories say that essentially this is sort of just a return to a high marginal product, where the idea is that these managers are actually bringing that much value. And then there's some more sort of pessimistic theories, or where the idea is there's more something more nefarious going on. Basically, essentially, some story like all the CEOs sit on each other's compensation boards and raise each other's compensation. So both theories exist. I'm not really a super expert in this specific literature on executive compensation, but it's obviously an important question.
Yeah, and there's one other area. So heterogeneity bubbles and crashes. You say more than 10 years after the Great Recession, macroeconomists still do not have a sound understanding of the root causes of infrequent but large economic crises. All we know is this is going to happen. We don't know when, we don't know how much, but it's clear that it's going to repeat. So do we have, after having seen a few of these, do we have a better feel for why these things happen?
No, I think in general, this is sort of one of the big sort of blind spots or open questions in macroeconomics. Why do such financial crises happen, and what exactly is the mechanism? And I mean, there are, the state of these theories is definitely better than what it was before the financial crisis. And what in particular we have pretty good theories of is, once asset prices crash and people are forced to deleverage, say in the last financial crisis, house prices crashed, and then a lot of people essentially had negative equity in their houses, say, and their houses were underwater in that sense. And then we have good theories of bad stuff happening, so this spilling over to the real economy essentially. But what we don't have super good theories of, I think, is sort of why do these sort of asset price bubbles, or what looks like bubbles, I guess, and crashes happen in the first place. And or at least let me put it maybe slightly differently. There are theories like this, in particular in the sort of finance and macrofinance literature, but what there isn't enough of, I think, is sort of putting these theories then together with the other theories that I just mentioned, which are the theories that say, how does the asset price fall then spill over into the real economy? And then in particular, sort of disciplining these type of theories with microdata in the way that allows you to make quantitative predictions. And so essentially, this is sort of probably the most ambitious of the projects or potential research avenues I'm discussing there. I somehow have this idea that somehow if you could somehow build a heterogeneous agent macro model of the type we just discussed earlier, that somehow can generate these asset price swings, that you could come up with a theory of financial crises that actually sort of can explain these type of crises that we see in the data. But this is sort of something where I don't have a very clear idea of how one would actually do this in practice, which is exactly why I put it under these sort of good open questions to work on.
Yeah. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about applications of these ideas, specifically in the COVID-19 shock that we're going through and the policies that different countries are implementing.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back. Ben, we were talking about heterogeneous agent, new Keynesian models, where the economy as a system has very high variance in the participants in that system in terms of income, wealth, financial flexibility, decision flexibility, and so on.
Right.
Hence, what we expect in terms of behavior, we can really model the system as sort of an average expectation because it doesn't really help from a policy perspective. Now, this is very topical as we go through this COVID-19 shock. And there are a lot of policy questions. One is sort of the lockdown question, timing, and the intensity of lockdown, and so on. And then there's the question of stimulus, how much, how to implement them, who should get them, and those questions. So,
Right.
I know that you have a very detailed model around this. Do you want to talk a bit about how you constructed the model?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be very, very happy to. So yeah, this is a joint work with my long-term co-authors, Greg Kaplan and Gianluca Violante, who are also my co-authors on this whole heterogeneous agent new Keynesian, so HANK agenda. So the key idea, so we started working on this sort of essentially in the early days of the pandemic. And we sort of thought that there's sort of three issues that are key for thinking through the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, two issues that also already lots of other economists had sort of emphasized, which is sort of obviously the epidemiological aspect, what drives infections, and second, sort of the macroeconomic aspect. So how does that interact with, you know, aggregate consumption and investment and so on? But what we thought, what sort of really important to bring in as well is sort of the distributional effects. And in particular, we thought that's important because the way this pandemic, you know, seems to play out is that some people are hit much, much harder than others. So some people are basically completely unaffected. Like, you know, you and I, we can keep doing our jobs more or less the same way we used to do it. I mean, we're just talking here right now on the internet. I spend, you know, a lot of time on Zoom. So I just do my teaching via Zoom now rather than going to the classroom, which is a little bit worse, but, you know, doesn't make that much of a difference. But on the other hand, there's other, you know, professions in particular that are much harder hit. So take a waiter for. So obviously, when there's lockdowns and the restaurants are closed, then the waiter, you know, can't do his job. But even without the lockdowns, I guess, and we saw this in the early stages of the pandemic, people would essentially stop going to restaurants. And so even because of that, sort of labor demand for waiters would have fallen. And so these sort of socially facing occupations would be hit much harder. And so essentially the idea was that we want to incorporate this in our model, and that there's these very differently hit people in the population.
And so if you take that sort of diverse population, does it have implications for, do we have any better predictions? I know there are models like the SIR model in terms of spread and so on. Does it have some implications for how we predict spread?
Right. Yes, a little bit, but not so much. So yeah, I mean, let me maybe as a background describe a little bit the type of model we work with. So essentially, we glue together two models. One is exactly one of these heterogeneous agent macro models, which is sort of bringing together the macro aspects and the distributional aspects. And then we essentially glue that together or combine this with one of these SIR models from epidemiology. So one of these susceptible infectious recovered models, or what's called a compartmental model in epidemiology. And essentially, the key idea is sort of to think about sort of the interaction between these two model elements. And what you see is that indeed sort of on the one hand, sort of the economic side affects the epidemiological transmission, and on the other hand, the epidemiological transmission affects the economics. So in particular, what you see is that, if infections are raging, then essentially people will cut back on what we call social consumption, or what the literature now calls social consumption, which is exactly going to restaurants, traveling, and so on. And that has an effect on the economy, even in the absence of any lockdown measures. Or sometimes people call this voluntary social distancing as well. So people sort of, being careful. There's sort of a fear factor where, if there's lots of people infected or lots of people dying around you, you don't go to restaurants as much anymore. So that's the, one direction of the feedback. And the other direction of the feedback is that then that type of behavior, so people being more careful, then also feeds into the epidemiological transmission. So if people don't go to restaurants as much anymore, then also the transmissions decrease. And then those two kind of effects will sort of balance. And so that's something we have in our model. But to be fair, that's also something that a lot of the existing sort of macro or epi-macro, sometimes people now call this, so epidemiological macroeconomics literature has. So that would be something even there that would be there even without the heterogeneity and the distribution. It gets amplified a little bit with the heterogeneity and the distribution, but not all that much. Does that kind of make sense?
There are two issues, right, Ben? One is if you take the system, there are certain initial conditions that we have already talked about, wealth and income disparity, and because of those diverse initial conditions, your expectations of behaviors of the agents are going to be highly varied.
Right.
And shock happens, and the shock disproportionately affect those agents, right? And so now, the behaviors that we expect from those agents are going to be, I would imagine, quite different, even from the original sort of steady state model.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So there's one key thing we see in the data, which is that sort of people who are most financially exposed to the pandemic, in the sense that they take the largest hits to their labor incomes, are also the most financially vulnerable, typically in the sense that they have the lowest amount of sort of liquid savings that they can use as buffers to sort of smooth out these shocks. So that's something we see in the data very strongly. So these kind of occupations that I talked about earlier, like waiters and hairdressers, so these sort of socially facing occupations, in the data they have much lower liquid wealth than occupations that can work from home very well. And so do you have this sort of unfortunate correlation there between exposure and vulnerability, which really sort of amplifies the distributional effects of this shock.
You talk about a distributional pandemic possibility frontier, PPF.
Right.
There is a trade-off between sort of severe infections, deaths, and so on against economic growth, right? So can we use these models to sort of look at what the optimum policy might be from a lockdown perspective?
No, that's exactly right. So yeah, so one of the main uses of this model is exactly we want to think about policy, and there's two sides of the policy. One is the sort of public health policy, and one is the macroeconomic policy. And on the public health policy, I guess the primary tool that's been used in most developed countries is sort of lockdown policies. And on the macroeconomic policy side, the primary tool that's been used by most developed countries is some sort of a fiscal support or a fiscal stimulus or social insurance, whatever you want to call it, policy. So in the US, that would have been the CARES Act in particular. So what we do to think about these two types of policy, we came up with this construct that we sort of termed this pandemic possibility frontier, or this distributional pandemic possibility frontier, which allows us to sort of trace out potential trade-offs between sort of health and wealth, if you want, or lives and livelihoods.
Yeah.
And in particular, and that's the important part, take into account distributional effects while doing so, right? So there are other papers as well which sort of think about this trade-offs between health and wealth or lives and livelihoods, but they don't take into account that the economic consequences are very unequally distributed because of all the things that we discussed before. And so essentially this distributional pandemic possibility frontier is essentially just a diagram which has, for different policies, it sort of always returns, a bunch of numbers. So in particular, it returns on the x-axis in the way we plotted the total number of lives lost to COVID-19, and on the y-axis, so that's sort of the health outcomes, I guess, or the lives, and on the y-axis it returns the sort of the economic outcomes, so the wealth or the livelihoods, I guess. And in particular, what it takes into account there is not just the average effect of different policies, but also the distribution. And so just to give you an example, so once we have this model up and running, right, we can exactly do what you said, is we can run sort of policy counterfactuals. We can say what would have happened in the United States if there hadn't been any lockdown whatsoever. Or we can say what would have happened in the United States if there had been a much longer lockdown. Or so now in the second wave of infections, there would have been another national lockdown of the type we saw in the spring. And so then the idea is that sort of varying these policies and sort of doing these, using the model as sort of a laboratory for doing these different counterfactuals that traces out this sort of pandemic possibility frontier. Now, what you see, for example, is that if you wouldn't have done any lockdown, obviously lots more people would have died because the pandemic would have swept the country in a much more aggressive fashion. So this is about the United States in this case, by the way. And what you also see is that then probably there would have been less economic costs than what we saw with the lockdown policies that were implemented. However, what's kind of important is the economic costs are still relatively large, even with a no intervention, so no public health intervention policy, no lockdown scenario. In particular, so it's not the case, for example, some people sometimes naively say that, if there had not been any lockdown policies, it would have all been smooth sailing for the economy. Okay. What we find very strongly is that that's not the case. That's a very naive position. In particular, even without lockdown measures, the economy would have taken a huge hit. Why? Because of this voluntary social distancing, or this sort of a fear factor. So people, because there's a raging epidemic, stop going to restaurants, stop traveling, and so on. And that then has negative effects on the economy. And in particular, these very strong distributional effects where you hit some occupations much more than others. On the other hand, if you did a really long lockdown, then you can save a lot of lives, but you at some point the economic costs skyrocket on you, and in particular, the distributional effects become a real problem, because some people who already kind of don't have any savings, you're kind of you're driving them out of work, and then it gets really bad for them, and they essentially can't put food on the table anymore.
Yeah, I would imagine, Ben, in these types of models, it's difficult to derive optimum policy, because even from a utilitarian perspective, if you don't have the value of life, you can't really do much about that, right? So I guess what we could do is to ask these questions, or run the scenario, so to speak. And then if we have robust answers to it in terms of duration of the pandemic versus, quick and severe lockdown and so on. So we could run some scenarios and look at what that implies for the system, right? And then let the public determine what the right policy.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the whole sort of philosophy of this pandemic possibility frontier is that, we don't want to, get into these philosophical or ethical debates on what's sort of the value of life. Or some economists, they have this. I saw that you had Pete Kleno on the show, for example. They have a paper, for example, where they, try to come up with estimates of what sort of the value of a statistical life, it's called. So what's the dollar value of a life that you save? And it's not like we have a problem with that, but we say maybe you don't want to take that strong a stand, and instead there's other factors that may make you decide on whether a policy is desirable or not, which you can't necessarily capture with this. And so we say we're just going to give you, the policymaker or the public, we're just going to give you sort of a menu of options in terms of these outcomes, in terms of lives and livelihoods, that then you, as the policymaker or the public, can choose from depending on what you think is the right way of making this trade-off. I mean, just to be clear, I do think, exactly because of what I said before, which is that even without the lockdown policy, the economy suffers quite heavy losses. For any reasonable values of statistical lives, like what, say, Pete Kleno would say is a reasonable number, you would want to intervene quite heavily in terms of lockdowns. And we're sort of reconfirming, I think, here a finding that the economics literature has found that I mean, you do definitely want to intervene a little bit or quite a bit if you value saving lives. But our point is sort of more general, and exactly, we want to maybe have more general policies, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing, Ben, I think, we have sort of different experiments run. New Zealand, South Korea, Sweden are examples of it. Now, exposed, we can actually look at the outcomes there, right? Could we actually derive some conclusions?
Right. So it's I mean, it's hard to generalize in particular, because the pandemic is still ongoing, and who knows what's going to happen going forward. Again, this is my sort of natural caution as an economist to to be nervous about forecasting. But yes, I mean, for sure, I mean, it does seem to me the case that essentially the countries that have sort of tackled the virus aggressively early on, and essentially done sort of the New Zealand or Australia and so on type policy, where they sort of closed off their borders and sort of just drove infections to zero, or what's sometimes called a zero COVID policy, have done quite a bit better in terms of both lives and livelihoods. Now there's a question, I guess, whether you can do this in practice. Can you actually, if you're the United States or the United Kingdom, completely seal off your borders and then drive off infections down to zero? Obviously, for New Zealand, it's relatively easier because it's sort of an island state. But I mean, some people have argued that, for example, a country like the United Kingdom should have done this. And I do think the prediction, I mean, this is, I should say, not something that we actually look at in our model for some technical reasons, this sort of zero COVID type strategy. But I do think I'd be pretty sure that if we were to look at that in our model and you can actually achieve that, that would give you superior outcomes. Essentially, sort of through in our sort of frontier language, it would sort of shift the distributional pandemic possibility frontier towards more desirable outcomes, where you have both less deaths and lower welfare costs, or lower costs in terms of livelihoods. So therefore, you sort of alleviate this trade-off, or even completely eliminate the trade-off between life and livelihoods potentially.
But do you see this just sort of a physical constraint? Australia and New Zealand have natural advantages, like you said, being an island. South Korea is not, and seems like South Korea has done pretty well as well. So could we, does this give us sort of enough data to say in the next round, a zero COVID policy might be dominant? Like you say, it's difficult to say because we didn't run this experiment in the US. But do you see there are reasons that would tell us that it's not possible if you're not an island?
Right. No, I agree with you that probably that at least if you're, I mean, again, for the US, it's a bit more difficult because it's such a big country. But for a smaller country like the UK, I mean, I don't necessarily see why they couldn't have done what, say, South Korea did. I think there's, I mean, this is now getting, this is me just being an informed reader of the public debate rather than this being based on my model, right? My impression is that a number of things work better in South Korea than in other countries like the US and UK. First, they did close their borders relatively early and then have these sort of quarantine hotels. Second, there's a better contact tracing system. And third, and that's sort of related, there's just much more enforcement of the rules than what we've done in other countries. So I mean, I can just see what's happening here in the UK. There's very little enforcement of any of the rules. I mean, I was in a shopping center in early December, just after the second national lockdown was lifted, and so Westfield Shopping Mall for people who know London maybe, and there was lots of people. Just, I mean, it was jam-packed. People were running around without masks, and I mean, it just kind of looked like it was sort of inevitable that this was going to lead to a bad outcome. And then lo and behold, what you saw is that infections skyrocketed a few weeks later in combination. And obviously there was the new variant of the virus, but I think even without that combination, infections would have grown a lot. And I think that's sort of what models predict. Essentially, if you lift the lockdown and you don't enforce any of the rules, you're going to have rising infections. And I think if countries like the US and UK could learn from countries like South Korea, these East Asian countries, and New Zealand, Australia, and just adopt some of these policies, I don't see any specific reasons why we couldn't achieve at least much better outcomes than the ones we've seen here.
Yeah, and you touched on this. So the other part of this is sort of the fiscal and potentially monetary stimulus to bring the economy back. You touched on CARES Act in the US. Right. What do we find from the model, sort of the effectiveness of the CARES Act? I mean, there are two questions there. One is obviously the design of it, and the other is the implementation of it. The implementation of it is, I think, is a little bit varied. Its effectiveness, but at least from a design perspective, what do you see?
No, so so in addition to thinking about these different lockdown policies, we also think about fiscal policy. And what we see is that the CARES Act in the United States was very effective at alleviating economic hardship. So in terms of this distributional pandemic possibility frontier, it essentially shifts inwards, sort of towards better outcomes, this frontier. So it essentially just gives you lower costs to livelihoods without really affecting deaths. So that's kind of a good thing to do. And through the lens of our model, what we say is that sort of economic welfare costs were reduced by 20 percentage points relative to the No CARES Act counterfactual that we can examine using our model. I think in general, what you see in macro models is that it's pretty hard to sort of, or fiscal support and sort of social insurance policies are kind of just a very good idea in these kind of models, and it's pretty hard sort of to overdo this. And the reason is just simply that is, again, it comes back to this correlation, between exposure and vulnerability, which is that some people literally just wouldn't be able to put food on the table without these support packages. So, people have very little liquid wealth. Their labor income gets wiped out. They can survive for maybe a month or two without fiscal support or with any help from the government. But then at some point they just run out of money. And so then if the government can borrow at cheap rates like it can in the United States now, and it can sort of use that borrowed money to give transfers to the people who are literally on the verge of starving, I guess that's going to be a good thing. Now, two comments on this. First of all, you don't need to believe in any sort of heterodox economic theories like modern monetary theory or anything like that to believe that. This comes out of a completely standard macroeconomic model. The only thing you need is that what's called Ricardian equivalence fails because people are financially constrained, essentially. And other thing is that I do think that, so this is true that this CARES Act was very beneficial, even though there would have probably been a lot of room for improvement for doing it better. So in particular, one thing, I do think there was a fair amount of waste in the way it was done. So in particular, these transfers were quite untargeted. A lot of money was given to sort of big corporations as transfers. So in particular, a large chunk of the CARES Act, right, was the PPP, the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, which I think a lot of it, or lots of economists think a lot of this was essentially just a transfer to firms rather than to workers, and also just the policy of sending every household a check of what was it? I guess $1,200, I think. It seems a little bit sort of untargeted. It seems like one could have done better by not giving you and I, or people like you and I, money, but like just giving the money to the people who really need it. But even though that's the case and it's sort of not entirely efficient, our model does predict that it was massively beneficial in terms of alleviating economic hardship.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important thing for us to think about. I don't know the details of it, but a large private university on the East Coast was first in line. They're sitting on tens of billions of foundation money, but they were first in line for the PPP program of more than $100. And so, like you say, the implementation of it is, I don't know if it was corrupt or it was just designed incorrectly or not targeted. And we are about to embark on this again. And there are a lot of debates around the quantity of the stimulus. That's where most of the debate is, but very little on the quality of the design of the of the stimulus. And I think what you're saying is that the design is at least as important.
No, that's right. Quantity. I mean, in the defense of policymakers, I do think, especially in the first lockdown, there's one factor that was of the essence, namely speed. They just needed to get this money out very quickly. And then they essentially just used an existing mechanism, which is these tax rebate checks, right? So, because you have all the addresses of people already, and you have a system for mailing them checks, so they just use the IRS tax rebate check system. Let me just tell you a little anecdote, maybe kind of interesting. So my My wife lives in Paris, but she used to work in the United States. So, for example, she got a CARES Act tax rebate check in the mail in Paris, signed by Donald Trump, and I mean, she hasn't cashed it yet. She maybe donated to charity or something. But I mean, that seems kind of absurd that they would send money to someone who lives abroad and doesn't even need the money, and that seems a little bit wasteful. At the same time, maybe that's a necessary cost you have to pay for getting this money out quickly. But I do think that now in the current round of it looks like they're doing another stimulus package, right? In the current round, it does seem like they could have probably come up with something a little bit more targeted, and there was definitely enough time to do that. But
this is a very interesting area, Ben. So in conclusion, if you look forward, if you take these types of models that seems to introduce a higher level of realism into how complex systems behave, do you think these could assist policies in a much better way in the future? What do you see in the next 5 years with these types of models?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. The goal here is to sort of make the policy making better or more realistic. And we do already see that a number of central banks have begun developing their own sort of heterogeneous agent models. And you do see these models referenced more frequently. There was recently a review of the mandate of the Federal Reserve Bank, and if you look a little bit at the footnotes there, or if you look at the statements in a bit more detail, now there's sort of distributional objectives are explicitly mentioned in the sort of mission statement of the Fed, essentially, and then if you look at the footnote, it sort of says, we've used the heterogeneous agent model to think about how monetary policy affects distribution, and we think that our new policy toolbox sort of works well for the distributional outcomes. And so, I mean, I think is that this will happen more and more. It's sort of, I think one other thing that's nice about these heterogeneous agent models, it just makes it easier for both policymakers and the public to connect with these models or think in terms of these models, just because you sort of, you can think about people that live in these models that are kind of like yourself, or like people you've met or seen, whereas then this abstraction of a representative agent that typically or the older models are about is like harder to connect to. So just for sort of storytelling and thinking through mechanisms in combination with microdata, that's where I sort of see the usefulness of these models.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, sort of playing scenarios with it. Even if you cannot reach an optimum policy, you can at the very least see what the real effects could be of a policy choice. And that should help us all. Yeah, excellent, Ben. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.